Good evening and welcome to this episode of The Mary Trump Show. I am thrilled and honored to have as my guest Ruth Ben-Ghiat, author of the very prescient must-read Strongmen from Mussolini to the Present. Sorry, Strongmen. And the excellent newsletter Lucid. Ruth, it is really good to see you and to have you on this evening. How are you? How are you
Good.
grappling with the fact that you were right about everything? And I safe to assume you would rather have been wrong. And like stuff keeps happening. So the hits keep coming. We've got bad news out of Italy. Um, things here are dire. So how are you?
I'm
Or is that not a
good.
fair question?
No, I'm good. I'm really pleased to be speaking with you. You two have been prescient about so many things. And I don't know, as a historian, which is how, in my case, I've been able to kind of see Trump for what he was really early. Um, Somehow there is a certain consolation that history has certain patterns. Doesn't mean that good things are going to come of those patterns right away,
Right.
but that that society, we're not the first society to go through this, and there are ways that we can learn from resistance efforts and stuff like that. So that's the optimistic side.
That that is optimistic. Although I have to be honest, I read your book again and it had a very different
Mm,
it was a very different experience from when I read it when it first came out a couple of years ago. Um because things are worse, quite
yeah.
frankly. And I don't think a lot of us anticipated that they would be worse if Donald lost, which he did resoundingly. Um, but part of the problem is the Republican Party didn't lose resoundingly.
Yeah.
And I'm beginning to wonder, do we learn? Do we learn enough? Because we are at what seems to be or on what seems to be a knife's edge here. And this is happening. It feels like it's happening again. Um, and in terms of, the rise of authoritarianism in Europe, we already have some entrenched autocrats there. We've got Orban in Hungary, we've got Erdogan in Turkey, and now in Italy, we have
Mm.
a neo-fascist who will likely be prime minister if she's not already. I don't know when the election, or I don't know how that system works, but clearly, I mean, she's on the brink of becoming
Yeah.
prime minister of Italy. And as you've pointed out in a couple of recent pieces, she's worse than some of her immediate predecessors like Berlusconi. And she's akin to Mussolini in a way that they aren't. She's worse than Marine Le Pen, which is really saying something. And all of this is happening in the context of the United States grappling with its own. And it's not even a flirtation anymore. We have one political party
Yeah.
that is full on. I think it's a fascist party at the very least. It's a pro authoritarian, anti democratic party, and obviously, if the Republican Party takes over, that changes the game enormously. But a- and I think the reason all of this is feels even worse than it is because it's all unfolding in an entirely new context, which is
Mm-hmm.
climate change. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have the luxury of decades to make a mistake and then fix everything. Not that we've ever fixed everything, but you know what I'm saying? Does
Yeah.
that urgency, or I guess I should ask first, how does that urgency play out in what we see happening everywhere?
Well, there's a very large scale, almost existential view is that, I mean, as we see with Putin's Russia, um, this kind of autocracy, they're not sustainable.
Right.
They, they're just not. And sooner or later, they all come to a bad end. And a lot of these strongmen are also not getting any younger, including Mr. Trump.
Yeah.
And at the broadest level, I really see these guys. I know there's a woman now, but these guys as dinosaurs
Mhm.
clinging to their outmoded fossil fuels and their repression and their lies, and they know they're they know they're not going to last forever, which is one reason I think Putin did what he did. And they're clinging on for dear life to exploit and plunder as much as possible before their time is up, because there's a huge amount of global energy for a progressive new era, and 2019 was the biggest year on record for nonviolent protest.
Right.
So there's this clash, but you're right that the cycle where, one society after another, as I document in my book, get into this and they don't see it in time and they're in denial. We don't have that time. But that's also why the global protest movement, look what's going on in Iran, and they're all different, but they are acquiring an energy and a momentum that perhaps we didn't see before.
It does feel like the urgency cuts both ways. On the one hand, as you say, there is I think a significant majority of people who are on the right side of things and do want change for the better and do want sustainable energy and human rights for everybody, etc. And that the the sense that we're running out of time is definitely a motivating factor, but it also feels like the right co-ops the fear that
Yeah.
engenders to fire up its significant minority of people.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. The
right?
survivalism. In fact,
Mhm.
a really important thing is the predominance of these, what I call survivalist ideologies. Great replacement theory is one,
Mhm.
um, where, the idea, because to motivate people to be ready to do violence or to be ready to embrace the big lie and be corrupt, because it's a form of corruption, embracing election denial. You
Mhm.
have to convince them that there's an existential threat, that they're in mortal danger. And that's what great replacement theory does. That's what, all this like discourse of democratic cities as crime ridden, dens of anarchy, or what Giorgia Meloni, the new, soon to be prime minister, she actually embraces, believe it or not, she's to the right of Tucker Carlson,
Mhm.
because her version of great replacement theory isn't just that there's demographic change going on and there's more non-whites being born, so let's say a passive thing. She actually believes, it's well documented, many tweets, many speeches, that there's a plot by the EU and George Soros
Mhm.
to flood Europe and Italy with non-white immigration and depress wages of white workers, and also, of course, extinguish white Christian civilization. So these are like this kind of survivalism. And Donald Trump is also a specialist in this, where
Mhm.
on January 6th, he said, if we don't fight, we won't have a country anymore. So the specter of obliteration is exactly what you're saying. It's harnessing this, instead of the obliteration that could come through climate change, you deny it, and you have a different kind of existential threat that is affecting the white male minority, and you harness that rage. It's really disturbing, but that survivalism, I think, will get stronger and stronger.
Absolutely. And what's also disturbing, besides the fact that George Soros seems to be so busy trying to undermine the world, I still haven't gotten a check from him, so I don't know what's up with that. But is that the real threats are threats that the right engenders, and the other threats are almost entirely uh, manufactured by them for that purpose. And I have no doubt in my mind that Tucker Carlson will start echoing or mimicking Maloney uh,
Oh yeah.
when he, his current shtick reaches the end of its viability, when it's not terrifying enough, and he
Yeah.
needs to draw more people in. And that also should remind us, as you do in, I think it was your recent piece for The Atlantic. Well, actually, they both touched on this, the piece in The Atlantic and the piece in MSNBC .com. You talk about the fact that Maloney has ties to the far right in this country, or I should just say the
Yeah.
Republican Party in this country. She spoke at CPAC in 2022, for God's sake. So,
Yeah, that's very important. She's fluent in many languages, but you're going to see more of her. And for those who, probably not your audience, but those who have struggled to see the GOP as a far right authoritarian party, it's very enlightening that I think I quoted in the MSNBC piece. She says very matter of factly, she had an interview with the Washington Post where there's a lot of whitewashing. She says, I'm a conservative, I'm just a patriot, which, and this is not true. She's a neo-fascist.
Right.
But she said, the Republican Party, we have the same battles, we're in touch, we have cultural exchanges. And she said, their fights are things that we have discussed too. And she said, they are registered as one of the European conservatives. And so this is a very matter-of-fact way of just acknowledging that the GOP is considered by people like Orban and Maloney as a far-right authoritarian party. It's just in this country, it's been very difficult to get people to see it in that frame. That's been my big battle, first with Trump and then with all of the GOP. But that's very enlightening, and we should think about that. What that means, that she just takes it for granted.
Yeah, I want to get to the fact that about the whole gender washing issue. That I think that's a term you coined, and I think it's awesome and very illustrative. I want to get to that in a second, but I want to stick with this. You wrote recently, history teaches us that whenever extremism is normalized, its effects remain in the culture. So it seems to me that this has been happening here in an accelerated manner since 2016, and maybe counterintuitively, maybe ironically, or maybe inevitably, it feels like it's worsened since Donald lost in 2020.
Yes.
So, two questions about that. One, first of all, how unusual is it for somebody with the kinds of authoritarian aspirations Donald has, and the incredibly powerful system he had supporting him, to lose power? And secondly, how dangerous is it? And in what ways is it dangerous that he continue to be the de facto leader of the Republican Party?
Well, the second thing, it's absolutely anomalous. In other countries where there's, what he did was a coup attempt, but technically it's a self coup because he was already there. He was trying to stay. In other countries around the world, like Indonesia, Guatemala, leaders that have a failed self coup, they have to leave the country.
Right.
They're not sitting around trying to run for president or whatever he's going to do and still being the cult leader. So that speaks to the strength of his personality cult, of his whatever the hell he has over all of these Republicans. The fact that every single day I think to myself, Mike Pence could change the game if he spoke out, and he's not speaking out. I'm very haunted by this. And of course, the only way to understand that little situation there and is authoritarian dynamics. And yet, whether it's on TV or in conversation, when I say very straightforwardly, well, there was a plot to have him harmed or killed, some people still can't quite digest that. They can't quite get there. Yeah. And it's kind of fallen off the radar. So
well, because he's allowed it to.
Yeah, he's allowed it to. But that's all very anomalous in a still functioning democracy.
Well, I guess that still functioning is the operative term there. Are we?
Yes.
I'm not so sure.
Well, but the other thing that is going on now, and this is what's accelerated, that Trump started it by subjecting the GOP to a kind of authoritarian discipline and training. And that meant demonizing external enemies and having new enemies like the press.
Yep.
Democrats are now political enemies of the state, Biden, but also no internal opposition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of chronicled that in Strongman up to 2020. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. Oh, yes. But the party, since he lost, and which created this huge emergency, right? And then the big lie is really one of the most successful propaganda devices of our times.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed people psychologically, his followers, to not have to reckon with the fact that he lost. And so there was no closure for them on this.
Mm-hmm.
So he was able to just continue on. And what's happened is what we're living through now is the remaking of the Republican Party into a far-right authoritarian party at the level of personnel, of political class, of ideologies. And so I wrote a piece I think it appeared in the LA Times, that compared it to other authoritarian party dynamics. And so you have a twofold thing that happens. One is if you need to refashion your party for autocratic rule in the future, you have to do like this kind of purge. So you have to get rid of some people, and that's the Cheneys, the Kinsingers, anybody who is against Trump. But the key is, who do you want in your party as the new political class, the new leadership? You need criminals. You need lawless people. And so that's a good interpretive frame for a lot of things that have been going on, from the fact that to get ahead in the party, you have to pose with an assault rifle. So you show that you are personally associated and capable of violence. And of course, Donald, modeled that in January 2016, saying you could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. So that opened that window. But so a lot of the people being invited in are now the most lawless extremist people, like Mark Fincham, who is a self-proclaimed oath keeper. And he was in the party, we could say, despite that, or it was just a fact about him. Now it's a badge of honor. Right. So now he's the Arizona candidate for Secretary of State of the Republicans because he's an oath keeper.
Right.
So
just really quickly, I want to remind people what that means. Secretaries of State at the state level do what? They they control elections. They make sure election results are certified. And he is one of many Republican candidates for that office. And it's similar with Republicans running for state attorneys general, that they will not accept results of the election if they don't like them. So, and we could talk about why that's obviously dangerous on its face, but that the Supreme Court is potentially about to give them a big assist in this area with a case that they're hearing this term. But, that's a little bit farther afield. But you're right. I mean, this guy is now running on the fact that he is an anti-government psycho, which would have been a hindrance 2 years ago, probably.
And the whole authoritarian playbook, the two things that work together very well, or three: you have propaganda, corruption, violence. And think about if you have an avowed violent extremist in the situation of authority over elections, because one of the big plays of this, kind of taking over the electoral system is to create an environment where polling places, which can now have poll watchers whose powers have been enhanced, and in many states the open carry, these people are going to be armed. So it's like a junta. Yep. You're going to go to the polling booth and there's some goon with an assault rifle who by law in some states they can be just a few feet away. And there's been scores of these bills
give passed. Anybody a bottle of water.
Yes, but don't give anyone a bottle of water. So you want to associate elections and election denial. You want to get people in there who are also violent. So that's where the extremists and the people who were at January 6th, who were bashing police heads, who are now being invited to run for office. it's very depressing, but it's familiar. Like the fascists and the Nazis were always recruiting criminals to, be in their systems, because it's great to have criminals. They don't need to be corrupted. I mean, this is why, this is one of these things that falls under the radar. During Trump's presidency, they changed the rules of the civil service application. So you no longer had to disclose certain things, like
right.
certain conflicts of interest. And so that was a way to get corrupt people in there so that the corruption could spread faster.
Yeah, and Donald's been a criminal since his early
This whole,
20s.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, maybe when I wouldn't be surprised if he were a criminal when he was a toddler. He's precocious in that way, but he's also gotten away with it, which is another reason. He sort of modeled this behavior and probably made it easier for other people, because I think we've seen time
totally.
after time people willing to go all in with him because they think they will be protected by the umbrella of his untouchability, and of course
Yeah.
that doesn't always work out for them. But there's another thing that you write. Well, actually, before I get to that, what is a little mystifying. I mean, maybe mystifying is the wrong word. Um, Not everybody who is in a Republican in office now is new, right? These are people who've been there
Yeah.
sometimes for decades, who still, they used to play by a particular set of rules. And to a person, with the exception of Cheney and Kinzinger, who, by the way, voted with Donald 93+% of the time, only they were willing to draw the line at insurrection. Everybody else is going along with it. And, that's it's a little hard for me to think that they have blackmail material or compromise on all of them.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the Republican Party, at least the modern version of the Republican Party, because as you know, the Republican Party is changed dramatically since Abraham Lincoln was at the head of it. That this has been in the party's DNA. I mean, I think that
Mm-hmm.
the American South during Jim Crow was a closed fascist state. So much
Mm-hmm.
like Italy, this isn't new. It's just a continuation of a long historical trend.
I agree. And what happens in history is you have these trends and these tendencies that some are overt, like voter suppression was always there, and some are a little more latent or they're fringe. And what happens over and over again is that these demagogues like Donald, they come and they consciously decide that they're going to radicalize, they're going to have a big tent for all the extremists. And so people who were on the fringes, this happened with Berlusconi too in Italy, who also formed Maloney just as much as
Yep.
Mussolini did.
Yep.
He brought neo-fascists into the government for the first time since 1945 in Europe. And I was there on and off. And these people who you used to laugh at, they were like these crazy fascists, like with connections to Mussolini, the original Mussolini.
Hmm.
All of a sudden, they're sitting in Parliament,
Right.
and so these things happen. And when you get those cultural shifts, and people see that they can really have power and influence, and the party can kind of be revitalized, then they all go along with it. And but you have to have, that's where the do leaders matter? Well, at certain points in history, they do, because you have to have a certain kind of person, and unfortunately, Trump fits the bill, who has the capacity to both energize people and also channel these certain energies and make people buy into this new direction.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and honestly, that's one of the most disturbing parts about what's happening in Italy. That Italy did attempt to reckon with its past. They did, at a structural level, try to change the government so that fascism could not make a resurgence.
mhm.
And yet, look, here we are. Nothing like that has ever happened in the United States. So I think if the worst happens in November, the slide down will be very, very fast. I don't think we will have 2 years to turn things around. I don't know that we'll be able to turn things around at all because,
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons the propaganda works so well for them is because most white Americans don't know anything about our history and continue to feel entitled and blinded by white privilege because a lot of them don't care to know that it exists.
Yeah,
But
and that's the purpose of all the school laws that
yeah,
are couched. They shouldn't have to learn anything that might cause them shame because they don't want you to learn anything.
mhm,
Um,
exactly. They really don't. Oh my gosh. Yeah, and that reminds me of I'm pretty sure you had Ron DeSantis in mind, so we'll get to him in a second. But another thing that I find really fascinating in terms of what's happening in the United States right now, I because in addition to the other points you make about the use of propaganda and violence and corruption, there's also this concept of virility. And which is why we're unfortunate enough to get pictures of Putin topless and whatever. Here though, there's this really bizarre emphasis on manly men, whatever that means. There's this incredible toxic masculinity that's being sold by the least man, again, whatever that means, because like, what does it mean to be a man? It means all sorts of things. But in their view, this macho, strong, um, I guess fantasy straight guy, the Marlboro Man or whatever. Um, we've got Josh Hawley writing a book about masculinity. We've got Ben Shapiro, talking constantly, and Tucker Carlson talking constantly about how real men are being threatened in America. And then, of course, we have the head of their party, Donald Trump, who, in my experience, is probably the greatest physical coward I've ever met. He's full of petty grievances. There's nothing virile about him at
no,
all. And that's kind of what trips me up. How do they get away with that? Why does anybody believe anything they say? Is it simply because the grievance has some kind of alchemical property that makes them feel seen and understood?
it's also, I spend a lot of time in the book going over their hysterical governance culture where because they have all, especially somebody like Putin or old-fashioned dictators, they act in an impulsive, emotional, irrational manner all the time. And I think I have a phrase: hell hath no fury like a strongman who doesn't get his own way, right? Or who wakes up in a bad mood,
Right.
that kind of thing. And you see this with Trump, where they're firing people, they're hiring people, they're insulting people, they have no filters,
Right.
right? So, but historically, unfortunately, these strongman types, they come up regularly when there are periods of great social change, where there's been a lot of progress in gender equality. It could be racial emancipation, workers' rights. And so white men feel threatened. And in other parts of the world, like in the Congo is another case study in my book. So it's obviously not white men, but it's the patriarchy is threatened.
Right.
And that's when these guys come up. And in fact, the real through line is persecution of gay people. And so the gender politics of authoritarianism, it's like a triad. So there's misogyny that gets institutionalized. So you put women down, then you exalt hypermasculinity. So you've got, Putin with the shirt off, and Trump had to borrow Sylvester Stallone's body in Rocky 3.
I was going to say
I,
he doesn't have a version of that that's not photoshopped.
I know.
Like,
I so wanted
all
to
he
put
does
that in
is
my book, but I couldn't. They wouldn't let me.
seriously? Because I
So
think it
you have,
mm,
yeah, you have so you got hyper masculinity. So you prop up a certain kind of man, the brute. You put down women, and then the third leg of it is you persecute LGBTQ, meaning non-normative
right,
male sexuality, as well
right.
as women and trans and intersex. So, but that's the and so when it's very makes perfect sense to me that you have the advent of the Hollies and the tanning testicles and the, Leni Riefenstahl fascist aesthetics, the fetish of the male, a certain kind of male body, right when it's part of this reaction to the Obama years, legalization of same-sex marriage, the admission of women into combat, um, as well as 8 years of African-American president. It
Right.
all goes together.
Right. Yeah. And that sort of brings us to the support given to this cause in this country by white women, because a majority of
Yeah.
white women continue to vote for this nonsense at the expense of gender equality, and now at the cost of having women in America in 2022 literally being second class citizens who do not have control over their bodies. And we could have had a woman as president. In fact, I believe she was elected, but too many things went south. And speaking of Hillary Clinton, she said something which I don't quite I mean, maybe it's out of context, maybe there was more to it, but I believe she was speaking directly about Georgia Maloney when she said, "The election of the first woman prime minister in a country always represents a break with the past, and that is certainly a good thing." Is it in this case? Is it a good
Yeah,
thing?
no, that's why I started my Atlantic piece with that. I was like,
Yeah.
no, not in this case. Um,
So can you talk
yeah,
about it in the context of gender washing and how that works? Because I think it's an incredibly important thing for people to understand.
yeah, I can't actually take credit. It's two female political scientists
Oh,
coined it, but but
but you
I'm
would
I'm
have if they hadn't, so that's okay.
I'm circulating their wisdom. But it's when female, far right leaders um, use their femaleness to. It has two manifestations. One is when they use their softness, and if you look, Marine Le Pen and Maloney, they dress in understated ways. Maloney wears pastels. They're very careful to, in a certain way, their image to seem kind of non-threatening, and that is a cover and a compensation for the absolutely brutal racism and real world violent effects that their rhetoric and their policies bring. And the other part is that they pretend to be, friends of women, and they get a lot of goodwill. That's where the Hillary Clinton, who's extremely sophisticated and smart, kind of momentarily fell for it. Like, oh, woman, wow,
Yeah.
that's great. And people think, especially in Italy, there wouldn't be a woman because maybe they see Italy as more misogynistic or Mediterranean, whatever these stereotypes.
Mhm.
But this woman, it makes perfect sense because she is a fascist, and she actually is a very tough woman. And when she speaks in certain of her rally speeches, there's one that's absolutely terrifying from this past June in Spain. She's fluent in Spanish. She spoke to a far right party, Vox. She's screaming in a way that if you're triggered by Hitler, or you can't stand people screaming, you can't watch it. It'll be too upsetting. And when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, she's like a Mussolini. And I don't say this lightly. I've spent many hours, too many hours, watching Mussolini scream at Italians.
Yeah.
So that's the real Maloney. And yet people fall for this. They think she's going to be good for women. Now, if you look at what her party's actually done in the places that they've governed locally, just as we can look at Florida or Texas and they want to scale it up, we can look at Verona or other areas where her party's governing. And what do? They make abortion harder to access.
Yeah.
So abortion is a big deal to get abortion rights in 1978 because Italy has the Vatican sitting inside it. That's like no other country has the
Right.
Vatican sitting inside it. So I don't know if she's going to try and get rid of, abortion, but they make it, it's just like you don't get rid of elections today. You game the system.
Right.
They're making it very difficult to access abortion services.
Well, you already
So
mentioned
you
that
can expect that.
yeah, the trend has taken hold. Was it Verona that is calling
Yeah.
itself
It's a
a
pro-life
quote
city.
unquote
Yeah.
pro-life city? But that is how it starts, isn't it? It's things
Yeah.
don't get codified right away. They just sort of create an atmosphere that
That's it.
makes right. And I I think that, we're long down that road here.
Yeah, we are.
Every day I'm trying not to think about it too much because the election is 40 days away, and which,
Oh,
is a long time in the sense of your day-to-day life, but it is also a terrifyingly short period of time. But there's really nothing I can do except what we're doing right now, talk about it, and hope people are listening. But whenever I do think about the election in November, I just have this moment. It's very similar to what happened to me the first 2 years that Donald was in office. I would just be going about my business and suddenly be struck by the knowledge that he was in the White House. And it was a really jarring, horrible feeling. And obviously, the worst hasn't happened yet, and hopefully it won't in November. But I have a similar sense of like, how is this even fucking close? Like, how is it possible that on the one hand, Democrats are offering choice and reproductive justice and living wages and social security and Medicare and on and on and on and on. And the Republicans are literally at this point offering tax cuts for rich people, destruction of the planet, and hate and cruelty. And yet we don't know. It's like practically a toss up who's going to be in power. And I think it's that kind of disbelief that handcuffs us a little bit because
I think so.
right.
Yeah, I think so. If we the Democrats with a small d have no response and no parallel of the extremely formidable right-wing media machine. Not just Fox News, but all of it. If you look at there was something on Twitter where Kara Swisher had a new podcast, and so there was a ranking of podcasts, and hers was at the top, but all the rest of them were, Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, all these right-wing people, the first five. Or if you go to Amazon and you look up books on authoritarianism, they're all by right-wing people like Ben Shapiro, and the
Mark Levin.
authoritarianism is coming from the Democrats. So they have effectively control of the narrative over tens of millions of people who they've been doing this with such repetition. I mean, think Tucker Carlson's a very effective propagandist. He's there all the time hammering away. Donald, 120 plus tweets every day for years. So they have been collectively so effective at shaping a worldview for millions of Americans where Democrats are now a political enemy, that that's how you get to the situation you described. I also think that I was very, very disturbed when I read that the Texas GOP passed a resolution where they call Biden an illegitimate president, and they call him an acting president.
Yeah.
An acting president. And this is for the moment, a rhetorical reality, their words, but this is setting up an impeachment or some other kind. I mean, a third of my book's about coups, so some action. I don't know what it's going to be, but this is one of these things you're saying, these small things happen and then they push the window of possibility. And if you call the president an acting president, it means he's like not staying around very long. He's supposed to be leaving. So I worry about that.
right, and he's acting in place of the person who should be there. So
Right. Yeah.
um I used to do a weekly piece called Get the Fascists Off the List, which tracked exactly what you were talking about. Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Substack, because 8 out of the 10 top political
Yeah.
Substacks are right wing or right wing adjacent, like Barry Weiss. And I stopped doing it because the list never fucking changed and it was just
Yeah.
demoralizing. So, like, what was the point? But you write about in your towards the end of your book, you write about how to combat authoritarianism, and two things that make so much sense. Prioritize transparency and accountability, right? Well, how do we do that when one, the media, for the most part, seems either completely happy to have this country be an authoritarian fascist country, or don't want to make that difficult call, right? So they pretend to be neutral. And the Democrats, I try very hard to pull my punches when it comes to Democrats because
Yeah.
we're not living in normal times. And it's not like I don't think we can criticize Democrats on policy right now because the alternative is what? Donald? I mean, imagine where we would be if Joe Biden had it won, right? However, when it comes to strategy and what we need to be doing in advance of the midterms, I still don't think the Democrats, despite Biden's very good speech, a couple of, well, it seems like 7 billion years ago, but I think it was a couple of months ago. Apparently the only important thing about that speech was that 2 Marines were standing behind him. But,
Yeah.
it was a speech about the dangers of what he called MAGA Republicans, because I don't think he can go all the way and indict the entire party. But with that exception, there doesn't seem to be the level of urgency and the level of honesty with the American voter that necessary in order for transparency and accountability to have the atmosphere in which to thrive or exist even.
Yeah. I agree, and there also has to be much more of connecting the dots for Americans. For example, on climate change.
Right.
Climate change, fossil fuel. Who is supported by fossil fuel? Who is supported by hate? And I think why that's not happening. I mean, there are many politicians doing it. It's just such a large country. When you study these other countries where there's been some success, they're much smaller, and they're also multi-party systems.
Yeah.
We
Yes.
have a big problem that the what Trump did was to, again, he put this authoritarian discipline onto that party and unified it, where you can't speak out. It has a pretty monolithic message. It has many messages, but they
Right.
have to be. Whereas Democrats, that's not the nature of Democrats, and the Democratic Party is many parties in one. I remember AOC said, in another country, I wouldn't even be in the same party as
That's right.
Biden. And so
That's
there's
right.
no maneuverability, there's no flexibility. And in other places, you've been able to, if people feel disaffected from a party that's becoming a right-wing authoritarian party, they can leave. And so this is like the problem of the third party.
Yeah.
So that's there. We have structural problems in our system that until recently people thought, oh, it's so stable in America, and look at those other countries, they're constantly changing governments, they're so chaotic, and we're so great with our bipartisan system. Well, now I see it as a huge problem. Even someone like Liz Cheney, who, as we know, didn't even vote for the John Lewis Voting Advance Act. She's
right.
No hero in some ways, but she doesn't have anywhere to go.
Right. Yeah.
So it precludes a dynamism. It's like these two huge monoliths. And so what do you do when there's an emergency? I know you started with the media, and we got to, but
no, but this is an incredibly important point, because I don't know. I mean, what can we do about the media? George Soros, get on it, please. Start some kind of huge liberal network.
I'm supposed to get my check with my last name. I'm supposed to be like a card-carrying globalist, but I haven't gotten my check either.
Oh God, it's just, we're running out of time, George. Come on. And we should both have our own shows on George Soros's vast liberal left-wing globalist network. But it's the structural problems that, because you're right, the party, well, I mean, the parties are too monoliths in the sense that there isn't anywhere else to go. However, the Republicans, because they keep kicking people out of their party, are truly monolithic in this, that they're all white, straight, Christian predominantly, misogynist, men or women, and Democrats are everything else. So that does make maneuverability difficult. And what's really frustrating about that is that the smaller and more homogenous the Republicans have gotten, it feels like they've gotten more powerful. And that's because they've been able to use the system against us.
Yeah, that's the dynamic. And but to go back to the accountability issue, and there are, we really need this different kind of messaging that is talking about outcomes. So, for example, let's take gun violence, because I'm starting to try to talk to business people about, like, you know what, authoritarianism isn't going to be good for business. This is one of the biggest myths, that it brings stability and calm. So if you look at the issue of gun violence, instead of talking about if you're speaking to people who are not already converted to progressivism, instead of getting into the issue of gun rights, you focus on outcomes. Is $280 billion a year, which is the cost of gun violence, is that good for business? Well, very few people would say yes, it's good for business. It's bad for the economy.
Yeah.
So in the same way, talking about outcomes of fossil fuels, talking about outcomes of people who incite violence, low-level violence, hate crimes, looking at economic and other outcomes is a way to connect the dots for people and talk about accountability. And that's not happening. There are individual strategists who are very good on this, but at a party level, at a national level, and also journalists are not having on some of the people who should be saying those things to the centrist shows, to the legacy networks, the ABC. I'm very rarely on ABC, NBC, CBS, where many undecided voters, many independent voters, they watch those shows. The CBS Evening News, right?
Yeah, and yet CBS hires Mick Mulvaney. So go figure.
So that's the other problem. If you're going to hire people like that, what is your message about accountability? So it's messaging at a different level to connect the dots, talking about outcomes in ways that the average person who may be a small business owner, who's undecided voter, can understand. So there are things we can do, but they're not being done at the scale we need them to be done, and they're not being done fast enough.
Yeah, and I think Republicans are historically better at connecting things to the economy, even as they strive to destroy the economy. Because last I checked, the Republicans are the only ones who've ever held the country hostage over the debt, or over raising or not raising the debt ceiling, as the case may be. Also, they focus on gas prices and inflation, neither of which is under any one person's control, even the president of the United States. And people seem to ignore the fact that the Democrats are the party that would, pay people a living wage so they could withstand the ups and downs of, or the downs of, a bad economy. But it's, yeah, the just the message isn't there, and unfortunately, of course, the economy does seem to be the main driver of who people vote for, even if the person they're voting for will make things worse because they're being lied to. There's a lot of lying going on, and that's part of the problem. But one more thing about accountability I wanted to ask you. What do we make of a country that cannot hold accountable, or I guess the structure of a government, right, that cannot hold accountable the very people who tried to overthrow that government, and not only can hold them accountable, but are allowing them to stay in positions of power within the government? So it's not just Donald, it's Cruz, it's Hawley, etc.
Yeah. No, in fact, if you study coups, like it was very evident to me that from the very, like basically the day it happened, that we were going to find out in time that a very large range of Republican actors were involved. It has to be that way. And we've seen through through the hearings, right, that are very, very valuable. And every time they air, I think, okay, we wouldn't have this in many countries around the world. There wouldn't
Right.
be a January 6th committee, an investigation. There would never
Right.
be hearings.
Right.
So, and and then the Secret Service and more and more institutions are being revealed to have been somehow touched by this coup attempt. And I was on an event a few months ago with other coup specialists, and there was one person who was from the conservative angle, and he said it wasn't a coup. It was just a disturbance because the institutions weren't involved. Because if you want to do a narrow definition of a coup, old-fashioned, it involved the military. Fine, the military wouldn't play Trump's game. But as it turns out, the Secret Service was involved, the National Guard was involved. There were all kinds of things involved, right? All kinds of institutions, and so that's the kind of thing, and all these people, the Mark Meadows, they're just going around doing their business, publishing their books, getting deals, and this is a sign of profound corruption within the system, and profound, even if we don't want to say corruption, profound inadequacy of mechanisms of accountability. It's really astonishing. If you study coups and authoritarian takeovers, it's really awful, and for what that says about protecting our country in the future.
And it's an instance in which past this prologue. I mean, we had we could go all the way back to the post-bellum situation with Robert E. Lee, but let's just go back to Nixon for a second. He was impeached, but he resigned, and he was able to rehabilitate himself. And the thing that just is mind-blowing is he was impeached for the wrong thing. He committed a much greater crime that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans because he played an instrumental role in prolonging the Vietnam War. So now we have Donald 50 years later, who is directly and indirectly responsible for the deaths of over 1 million Americans, and weakening this country to a degree that I believe is unprecedented in history, weakening the Western alliance, threatening the existence of NATO, and then, as you said, attempting a self-coup, which he almost pulled off. I don't think people understand how close we came that day. And by the way, he succeeded to this extent. The certification of the Electoral College was not carried out on the day it's supposed to be carried out. So that's not nothing either. So how do we? It seems one of the problems seems to be conveying this to people in a way that's comprehensible. And I think about what Donald is finally dealing with now. If you're objective, you think, okay, this is a person who's gotten away with stuff for a really long time, and hopefully it's catching up with him, which is why there's so many investigations and lawsuits, etc. But if you're inclined to support him, it's going to seem like people are out to get him, because it's unthinkable that one person can have committed so many crimes and gotten away with them. And I think that's part of what we're kind of grappling with right now.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, another unprecedented thing is that, Trump must be very doubly feeling like the victim, because his big lie thing didn't work for him.
Right.
Like, he wasn't actually able to stay in office, but the party embraced it.
Yeah.
They embraced the coup. They are all living high off the big lie. In fact, there's now a plethora of mini Trumps. Then anybody can become a little Trump. And if they don't like the result of the election, they can just say it didn't happen. And you must be particularly upset with Mr. Ron DeSantis, who has learned all of his lessons and was, as the most ruthless of the bunch, was the earliest to start his office of, quote, election crimes. And now he made those like sham arrests, and he's learned all of the lessons. But he's flourishing, and Trump's in limbo, which increases the odds that he has to run for office, because he's got to get back in and shut everything down, take revenge. I have zero doubt that this is how strongmen are.
Yes, I was going to ask you that, so I'm glad you went there.
Yes, once they get in the system, look at Berlusconi.
Right.
It's very important. Berlusconi had an enormous personality cult. He was so corrupt. I can't even describe. He was ultimately convicted after he was forced to resign. They started prosecuting him, and they tried to prosecute him. He had dozens of corruption trials while he was prime minister. Nothing could touch him, because he would change the laws. Like, if he was accused of bribery, he got Parliament to change the law so bribery was no longer punishable with jail. Like, that's what he would do. For years, he did this stuff. So finally, he's booted out because of the Eurozone crisis. They prosecute him, and he's convicted. So he's a convicted criminal. He's back in power now, and he's a convicted criminal. The key thing was that prosecution was the only way that his personality cult started to deflate, and his party finally lost its hold. And he was banned for politics for 5 years. And that's what made his party go from the mighty powerhouse to now it got like 7%. The fact he's back in power again, it means that once they're in the system, you never really get rid of them.
Right.
However, his most lethal, dangerous self was deflated because he was prosecuted and convicted.
Do you think we're capable of that kind of action against somebody who, was in the Oval Office and was protected by a very corrupt DOJ, but let's be honest, is still being protected by the DOJ in at least one instance? They took over the defamation case that E. Jean Carroll brought against him. So obviously we know more now about what the DOJ is doing in other arenas, but are we as a country capable, do you think, of taking that kind of, I guess it would be considered drastic since we've never done it before, action?
But everything, I think, I mean, I don't buy the unprecedented myself, because everything about Trump was unprecedented. He was unlike any other president. He was an autocrat.
Yeah, that's true.
So that everything he did was unprecedented. The guy spent 1 out of every 3 days visiting Trump branded properties. Like, nobody else ever did that. And just to there's so many other things one could say that he did. Right. Bigger and smaller.
Yes, we unfortunately we don't have seven years to go through the list of transgressions. God.
Yeah, it's incredible. I think we're capable of it. I think there are many people in government, like Jamie Raskin and many others, who get the severity. I think that I don't know why January 6th didn't make more of an impetus, besides the January 6th hearings, to get this guy out, because the only thing that's going to stop, and he's so dangerous right now that now he's cultivating the QAnon tribe.
Yeah.
This is very, very dangerous. And why is he doing it? It's because when a strongman's personality cult and authority starts to waver, because he's been out of office a long time. You've got DeSantis. DeSantis is backed by 45 billionaires right now. That was the last. It went from 40 to 45 in the last 2 weeks. He's got a huge amount of support for whatever the heck he wants to do.
Right.
And so Trump's star is a little shaky. And so what is he doing? He's getting a new bespoke army of thugs to use as his bidding. So he did that in January 6th, but some of those people are prosecuted now. And now he's got an existing cult. He's very smart as propagandists. You take an existing cult and you try and get them to transfer their affections and blind loyalty onto you. And then you have a ready-made army. And so I was very frightened when I saw that rally with them, like hailing him like he's the, Hitler 2.0. That's not good.
No, that might be the understatement of the century. It is not good. And it's another instance of how, and I hate saying, well, it's not really a compliment unless he would consider it a compliment, how good he is at using microaggression and micro concession to get people to do his bidding. And the biggest danger is, like, he was already able to get people who were probably, relatively well-adjusted people to cross certain lines. And now he's got people who there are no lines. They'll do anything because they're
that's how it ends up,
right? Yeah,
that's how these things end up, and each situation is different. And what's so extraordinary about this entire Trump, what can we call it, experience, is that it's
nightmare.
all happened.
I think nightmare works.
Nightmare. It's all happened in an open society, because the other people whose cults have been, Berlusconi owned like almost all the TV networks.
Right.
So he had an easier time of it.
And it's a much smaller country.
But Trump also, Berlusconi, like Mussolini, founded his own party. Trump came in to this storied, grand old party, took it over, and totally changed in really short period of time, all of the party dynamics, media landscape, everything. Twitter became just focused on him. It's like it's quite extraordinary what he's been able to do, considering we're not a one-party state.
Right.
We're not even an Orban state.
Right.
So these dangerous figures have to be taken out of circulation with prosecution. If not, they never really go away. And here we have Berlusconi's back in government again as a convicted criminal.
Right.
Wiretapping, tax fraud, bribery, sex with a minor, and something I'm forgetting. Those were his categories of conviction.
First, I thought you were talking about things Donald could be indicted for.
They're very similar. That's why I'm using. He's a very good. That's why I want to keep mentioning him, because he was gone and now he's back.
Yeah, and he will, with the assent of Maloney, he will share in that power, I'm sure, in some way, because she's probably indebted to him, and they're on the same page. I'm glad you mentioned the cult issue. Like, how do you start a cult in an open society? Because that's also been driving me crazy. Cults are closed systems. They are heavily monitored. They are top down. They are very difficult to break out of. Everything is controlled. Everything from what you eat to what you sleep to how you are allowed to communicate with others or not outside of it. And the only explanation I've been able to come up with is that because media have become so siloed, and people have, that there is very little interaction among people who think different. Like, I don't have any friends anymore who are Republicans, and I'm I guess that's just what's getting replicated, right? Because Donald is so divisive. It's one of his great skills that he's made it shameful to have anything to do with somebody who isn't 100% supportive of him. It's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, and don't just the pandemic.
Yes,
It was hugely influential because
such a good point.
Healthy civil society is maintained because you don't have to be in a small town. You can even everybody within big cities. You have your neighborhood,
right?
And in that neighborhood, you go do stuff, and you cross paths with all kinds of people, and you may know that they don't share your your political views, but you are doing things together.
Right.
Or you're in church together. And with all of that removed, all of that interchange removed, and people sitting at home, like my mother became radicalized during the pandemic. She lives in England in a village, a small village, and she started watching RT, Russia Today, and she went from a queen-loving conservative to a far-right wacko who was talking all about, like, Putin was never mentioned in our home before or by her. And the day she said to me, "Why isn't Biden doing what Putin wants?" I almost fell off my chair. I thought, oh my God, I study this stuff. And here she is becoming an agent of the Kremlin, which is what the Kremlin playbook. And why did this happen? Because she wasn't going to the coffee shop. She wasn't going to the florist. She wasn't mixing with people. She was sitting home watching RT. And so this is what that was the contribution of the pandemic to this siloing.
That's such a good point. And the other thing too is that during the pandemic, it was really difficult to be happy about anything. So grievance played well. Anger played, because we were all angry and terrified and aggrieved just by the fact that we were trapped and worried constantly about ourselves and people we love and isolated, of course. So that's, you throw all of that into the mix, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that we are where we are. Probably the only thing that should surprise us is that Biden won. Right?
Yeah, that's why I started as an optimist. I'm going to come back to.
Thank you, because otherwise nobody's going to be able to sleep tonight. So please say something.
And we haven't talked about the Globalist Puppet Master Conference yet.
Oh, we'll have to do that next time, but I need to hear more about that.
It's a conference that Bannon is putting on, just to let everybody know. It's really called Globalist. Well, it was supposed to be at the Hilton in Torrance,
oh, that's
California.
Right. I'm sorry. You just told me.
It's really called Globalist Puppet Masters. Who are they? What are they doing? It's like a tutorial on globalist puppet masters.
And thanks to you, Hilton is regretting
Hilton, so
terribly. Hopefully. But the fact, but also, God, like, why isn't Steve Bannon in jail? Like, why? And that's another huge problem. I don't want to go down another road, but right. It's like, if these people were in jail, they wouldn't be able to keep stirring things up. So give us a little bit of optimism and maybe even hope, please.
Well, yeah, many people thought that Biden wouldn't win. And also, it's just really important that since Trump came in, we had two of the biggest nonviolent mass protests that we've ever had.
Yep.
And that is a recognized, the history of resistance, mass nonviolent protest is extremely important all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to talk more about the Women's March. We never talk about it anymore. And it was just so important. And thousands of women went into office and went into politics. And then in the middle of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter, which involved up to 20 million Americans, that had a direct result in Biden's victory. It was a contribution.
Right? It wasn't just one day.
Yeah. So, and even the reaction that's happened after the Supreme Court, aggression on abortion rights, there's so many women are rushing to register to vote. There's a tangible grassroots reaction. So I never want to give up on the American people. You never know. And there is a way in which um, uh, it may take them till the 11th hour,
Mhm.
but people understand the stakes, and act accordingly.
I'm absolutely with you. I was having dinner with a couple of friends, and both of them were like, we're gonna lose in November." I said, "Absolutely not. I refuse to concede that. We still have time, and we, nobody knows. Nobody knows. So, we have to act like we're going to well, actually, we need to act like we're running 10 points behind, but we can catch up, but only if
Yeah,
everybody votes. I think that's, nobody get complacent and nobody get hopeless. I think that's the line Democrats need to walk. So I appreciate that reminder, because it is hard sometimes to
of
remind
course.
ourselves
Yeah,
that think not only can things get better, but we are the agents of that. So Ruth, I so appreciate your coming on. I love talking to you. You are so expert at explaining this complex, important information in a way that doesn't just make sense, but it's compelling. And I've learned so much from you. So thank you for being here. It was great to see you, even though virtually. And hopefully you can join me in the Nerd Avengers for a strategy session one of these days, or the next January 6th hearing, if that hopefully ever happens.
that happens. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. I feel the same way. And your writings and uh, everything you do has been very important. So
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. And I will see you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much to my extraordinary guest, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's smart. She knows this stuff so incredibly well, and it's so relevant right now. And I'm also honored to be able to call her my friend. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. Um, you can catch the next Mary Trump Show strategy session with the Nerd Avengers next Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific on youtube.com/Politicon. And of course, our regular Thursday show is next week at 9 p.m. Sorry, not 9 p.m. What time is it? 7 p.m. 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, also at youtube.com/Politicon. And while you're on Politicon's YouTube channel, please subscribe to Politicon. It's free. It's just, we want to increase the numbers of people who subscribe, like the episode, click on this bell, because that way you will be notified whenever a new video drops. Because in addition to the regular shows, we have our emergency sessions, we have live streams of January 6 hearings or important speeches, and some of my shorter videos. And of course, you can also listen in podcast form on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And a 5-star review would be very much appreciated, because it really helps other people find the show. And the more people listening, the better. We've got 40 days to get momentum going and pull out a win in on the election day. I think it's November 8th. It's so close. It's kind of terrifying. So, there's a lot we can do, though, in the meantime. So spread the word. And thank you again so much for being here tonight. I will see you next Tuesday. Have a wonderful weekend. And in the meantime, please stay safe and be kind.